The following is an unrehearsed interview with Mr. Malcolm Kilduff, former Assistant Press Secretary to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. The interview was conducted by William H. Berge, Director of the Oral History Center at Eastern Kentucky University. The interview was conducted at the Comprehensive Care Center in Beattyville, Kentucky on March 29, 1978 at 10 a.m.
Well, Mac, we've been at this a long time, 5 months, but just not too many meetings because of the winter. And there are a couple of things that strike me that as being kind of interesting that I should ask you about.
Yeah, go on in.
There are a couple of things before we go on and finish up that I'd like to ask you about. What do you think about the Warren Commission? I never have asked you that.
Well, Bill, I don't know what to say about the Warren Commission. Because anything that I say about it, or these commissions, these recent House investigative commissions, that were headed up by this guy Sprague, under, who was it, Henry Gonzalez of Texas, and then I think it's now under Jim Wright of Texas, congressman. This may sound egotistical, but I have to ask myself, why didn't the Warren Commission, since on reconstruction of the motorcade I was the closest one to the gun, why didn't the Warren Commission ever talk to me?
Well, do you know?
Why? No, I don't know. They never called me. They never questioned me. They never sent an interviewer to talk to me. And neither has this Committee on Assassinations. I made myself known to this guy Sprague way before I left Washington and said, I'll be very glad to offer you anything I can. And he said, give me a memorandum. Well, the last thing in the world I'm ever going to do with somebody, if they haven't got any more interest in what I have to say, than to say, give me a memorandum, can go to hell. Because if he has specific questions, I'll be glad to answer those specific questions. But I don't know. I could write a memorandum of 2 pages, or I could write a memorandum of 200 pages, and still not cover the one obscure little item that he may be interested in, if he has any interest, or if he knows what in the hell he's looking for, which I sincerely doubt. So therefore I absolutely refuse to just sit down and write these clowns a memorandum, but I didn't even get that much of a courtesy from the Warren Commission. So I do think that the Warren Commission's basic findings on who fired the shot, etc., were accurate. I think the Warren Commission will tell you that one shot went through Kennedy and into Connally. I totally reject that finding, because if that bullet had in fact done what the Warren Commission found that it did, John Connally would be dead, because it would have ripped through John Connally's heart, because it puts John Connally in direct line with the bullet, which would have gone into his right shoulder and come out his left chest, which would have ripped his heart. Whereas the way it was, he turned, and I've talked to Governor Connally about it, and indeed it was the second shot that went into Connally, because he turned around, and as he turned around, therefore the bullet entered the way it did and came out the way it did. And I've seen the scars, and there's no way that those scars could have occurred
from the one bullet.
From the one bullet and coming in, unless it had decided to make a 45-degree turn and still had the same speed, which it just plain couldn't have done. But the Warren Commission found that concluded that that was the case because they couldn't find the third bullet. They could only find 2. Well, that's precious little proof on my part, because I believe the one bullet probably disintegrated, the one that hit Kennedy's head, because so much of the president's head was gone. Blazes, they found part of his head in the street on November 22nd, 1963. So why shouldn't that bullet also have been out in the street? Or parts of it, or a half of it, or a quarter of it. They found fragments of the bullet. They never found the whole bullet, so therefore they say that the third bullet didn't exist, it misfired. Well, for a man who was as accurate as Lee Harvey Oswald was in the shooting of those bullets, I don't believe that he had 2 direct hits and 1 complete miss without even hitting the car. That just doesn't. None of that makes any sense. And I think because they couldn't find it, they forced themselves into an erroneous conclusion. So I really have no argument with the finding of the Warren Commission, other than that fact. And I have to question as to if they. I reject. First of all, let's go back to something I think I've said before, but I do reject a conspiracy theory. Reject it out of hand. Yeah, but where was I on that? I do reject a conspiracy theory, as I've said, for a number of reasons. Number one, I think that the subsequent investigations by the FBI and other agencies would have turned up a conspiracy. But I think one of the reasons that Lee Harvey Oswald's actions were successful is that it was not a conspiracy, that he kept his own counsel, that he made up his own mind to shoot the President of the United States, that he went there with that sole purpose in mind and performed the act that he had conjured up. Because there have been many times in the past where people have talked about shooting the President of the United States, and they'll talk about it in a bar, they'll be overheard, and then somebody will turn them in and it gets found out. But the one thing that the Secret Service was always concerned about, and I suppose they are to this day, is a man who just quietly makes up his own mind that he's going to work himself into a crowd, such as that gal who, what was her name, Squeaky Frome.
Or the guy who shot Wallace.
Or the guy who shot Wallace, who just out of a clear blue sky just comes up and bang, and there it goes. So there you do have a situation where Oswald just acted on his own without saying anything to anybody, and bang, and that was the end of it.
So I take it then that another area you might be somewhat concerned about the Warren Commission is probably the process they use too, in which somebody like you wasn't called to.
Well, I mean, I have to ask, Bill.
You'd want every source imaginable, you would think.
That's
you?
right. And I have to ask myself, I mean, as I say, let me repeat again, I don't quarrel with the findings of the Warren Commission, but what I do quarrel with, and have to ask myself that one remaining nagging little question, that if they missed talking to the man who was the closest to the gun in the motorcade, who else that would have meant something to their final conclusions was also missed? Well, I have, of course, no way of knowing who was missed or who should have been talked to.
What if they talked to anybody else who was in the car with you?
I understand that they did talk to Merriman Smith.
And you were right by the window.
But I was by the window, and he was in the middle trying to grab a telephone. And he wasn't looking out the window. He couldn't see. He could see absolutely nothing. I think that they might have talked to Jack Bell of Associated Press. I don't know, and he's dead now, so he's kind of hard to get in touch with.
Yep.
So.
There were a few other things we had about. What were some of the others, Dave, you were thinking of?
I've been Bobby Baker.
Well, I asked you about him one time.
Yeah.
Well, how about you know a person you never mentioned? Evelyn Lincoln. What about her?
Well, she was just a private secretary.
Did you see her a lot much?
Oh, sure. You'd have to see her. You'd have to go through her office every time you went to.
What did you think of her?
Well, she'd been with John Kennedy, a great number of years. She was a nice enough person and didn't have an awful lot to do with the staff. She did an awful lot of the personal work for the president, on his bank accounts and taking care of personal matters so far as the family was concerned. And she was very closed-mouthed, and until she wrote her book too, about what she had done. You couldn't get. If you asked her where the president was, if he was 4 feet away, she'd say, well, gee, I don't know, I'll have to check. She was ultra cautious. But that was good. That's
good secretary.
Yeah. In other words, she did her job well. She didn't endear herself to the staff, certainly. staff. She was not overly popular with certain members of the staff. I personally had no problems at all with, but I know some of the others were always complaining about her being the guardian of the door, and part of the palace guard syndrome that you find around any president.
What I'd like to do now is do something which is going to be very interesting to me, because I've become very interested in what you've been saying and sort of your career. Yeah, it might not be as important to some people, but I think in a lot of ways it's quite important. I'd like you to tell me how you came to leave the White House and what you've done between that time and now, as much as you want to tell me.
That takes a period of 13 years.
Yeah.
After the election in 1964, I decided, and I'd had several offers to do public relations work in Washington, and the money offers were quite good, and you burn out very quickly in the White House. As it was, I had lasted possibly longer than almost any assistant press secretary since Roosevelt had lasted, because they would come and go like it was a revolving door. The previous assistant press secretary, Andy Hatcher, had left. There was a man by the name of Jake Gildner. He didn't last too long. So there came the problem of, how long do you hang in there? How long do you work an 80-hour week? How long do you go without seeing your family?
How much static do you get at home because you're doing that?
That's right. Absolutely right. It's a funny thing. You might think, well, gee, a wife would be very understanding of the fact that, after all, you're doing it for the President of the United States. But she's no more understanding of it than if you're working in a clothing store. That's just the place that you happen to work. And, well, tell the President you can't work this week. And sort of thing. Sure, of course you do. Hi, Prez. No way. I got to take Friday off to go to the circus.
Let me ask you one other thing before. I'd like to come back to this, but I was thinking when you were talking about seeing Conley scars. Were you working in the White House when that famous picture of Lyndon showing his
appendectomy or gallbladder operation? Yeah, I was there.
That caused a lot of furor. I mean,
what a tempest in a teapot.
Yeah.
It was like his driving down the Texas road throwing a beer can.
Or exposing himself. You just thought the way the people reacted to it.
It was not that at all. And then the beer can, it was not on a Texas highway. It was on one of his own ranch roads.
Yeah.
And furthermore, he wasn't driving; he was riding, and that story got screwed up. Marianne Means.
And it wasn't a beer can; it was a Scotch bottle.
No, it was a beer. It was a beer can, and but the problem there was it all came from a girl with the Baltimore Sun, Muriel Dobbins. Muriel Dobbins had been out with him, out on the road. He was taking a group of reporters after one of his press conferences. He'd asked some of them to stay back, and he'd show them the ranch, and it was Marianne Means at first, and Muriel Dobbins was another one. And I forgot who the other two were. So he just drove them around to show them the ranch, and this was a very off-the-record type of thing, where he enjoyed their company and the give and take from news people. And so they were riding around, and he had a beer in this little holder in the front there of the car. And he finished with it. He threw it out on his own property. It was not on a Texas state highway. It was on one of his own ranch roads. And Muriel Dobbins was, I guess, she came back to the Driscoll Hotel in Austin and just told everybody under the sun, oh, I went riding with the president, and he was drinking beer and threw a beer can out. And from that, someone from the wires picked it up, and it got on the wire. And once it gets on the wire, you know what the distribution there is.
Yeah.
It was nationwide. And it was a stupid thing for her to have done.
President Johnson did like to be in the company of women, though, and talk to them, didn't he, like that?
Yeah, sure. And, and oftentimes he'd keep Garnett Horner, the man. He'd keep other newsmen, Bill White. He'd keep, it was women and men, too. But he enjoyed the give and take with the press on an informal basis. He hated the formal press conference.
Yeah.
He never did really adapt himself well to the formal press conference. for a number of reasons. Number one, he couldn't be as candid as he'd want to be. And number two, he always had this nagging feeling that he was being compared to John Kennedy's press conferences, which had become almost a weekly institution.
And he was being compared.
And I guess he was. See, I was too close to it to see that. And I kept telling him he was foolish. Therefore, you find that he held press conferences. And for instance, John Kennedy always held his press conferences in the State Department auditorium. Lyndon Johnson, the record will show, held exactly one press conference in the State Department auditorium. I told him it was my feeling that he should go ahead and continue to hold them there. There were filing facilities nearby, which they'd set up. The acoustics were good. The camera locations were good. Everything was well adapted to an orderly press conference. Well, he went over there and he held one, and then driving back, he says, "All right, now I've held my goddamn press conference in the State Department auditorium." He said, just like Kennedy did. He said, "That's the last time I'm going there." And that was the last time he went there. He did hold one more in the International Conference Room over in the State Department, where everybody can sit down at a table. But that didn't work out too well, and from then on, he did this Saturday morning press conference bit. He'd get restless on a Saturday morning if he wasn't traveling, and he'd hold these walking press conferences, where all the press corps would be told the president will see them at 11 o'clock, and they'd flood into this was Jack Valenti's idea, who never really got over being a Houston advertising man, who knew about as much about the needs of the press as I know about having a baby. And he would have these informal press conferences walking around the south lawn of the White House. Now, how in the name of God do you hold a press conference walking with 150 people around you, and you're asked a question, and nobody knows who asked the question, and nobody knows really what he answered? I tried to stay as close as I could, making notes as I walked. Then we'd get together and try to construct some sort of a memorandum of at least the subjects that he covered. And there would be 16 different interpretations of what he said in the Sunday papers. There'd be stories thrown together fast because of Sunday deadlines are so early on Saturday afternoon. But he didn't understand these things. He did not understand the legitimate needs of the press, where you have to have, when the President of the United States is talking, it has to be something that is accurate and recordable for history. But we have no records of those press conferences, other than if you take a half a dozen newspapers and try to put together, what was actually said. There were no transcripts. That's terrible.
But you got to explain to him? What was his reaction?
His reaction was that if you don't like it, who are you going to report me to? And that was kind of hard to find who his boss was. And if he wanted to do it that way, he was going to do it that way. And then he switched, and he decided he'd hold some press conferences in the cabinet room of the White House. Well, at least there we could get a microphone on him. We could get a camera on him. And then in the White House Theater, he didn't like that, so then he held a couple in the Rose Garden, where we were able to get microphones on them. At least we had them behind a podium where we could at least get what we said. We weren't always able to get the questions too well, but at least we were able to get the answers. But then he'd hold these impromptu press conferences, and then out at the ranch he'd want to hold them. He'd hold them in the front.
Early in the morning?
Yeah, early in the morning, and you'd have to traipse everybody out there at 5 o'clock, and we'll get them on buses at 5 o'clock in the morning. And get and then he'd get annoyed if the cameramen were out there fooling around in his own front yard early in the morning, but he wanted to make sure he was on television. Well, on a Saturday morning, you take a look at your television programming today, is no different than it was then, in '64. You'll find that there are very few national news shows that amount to anything until Monday. Really. So you had the President of the United States giving a press conference out on the porch of his house, and sure, there was all kinds of film on it, but no place to show it. So, it would break the Sunday morning's newspapers. He thought that the greatest thing in the world was to get his press conferences in Sunday's newspapers.
All right. Let me just ask you something about these things. Personally, where did you have the most fun going? Those trips down to Texas with Johnson, or those trips up to the Cape with the Kennedys?
They were two entirely different types of fun.
Well, which did you like best?
Oh, I guess the Cape.
Less travel and a lot of other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you went up there on a Friday afternoon with Kennedy, you didn't see him again until Monday morning when you were getting ready to come back to Washington.
You were just there.
You were there protectively in case he decided to do something. You held one press conference. That was at 12 o'clock on Saturday at the Yachtsman Motel. And that would be the end of it. I mean, it was looking at it very selfishly, it was a weekend of relaxation. You could do pretty much what you wanted to do, and the president did too. Whereas if you went for a weekend with Johnson, he was 60-some miles removed from him in Austin, and he was out at the ranch.
And he still wanted somebody out there, some newspaper press people out there. He wanted to get them out there sometime over the weekend.
Well, he'd go to church, for instance, on Sunday morning. Well, that meant the reporters and the photographers would have to traipse on out there, and then one of us go with them. Because if he saw a pool of 6 or 10 reporters had come out because they had nothing better to do on a Sunday morning, have to catch him going to church and hang around out on Ranch Road 1 to see if he was coming out to go to church, well, you'd better be with him. After all, that's what we were paid for. So many times we just sit there, and then on a couple of occasions, you'd see him all right, but you'd also see him taking off in a helicopter and having absolutely no idea where he was going. Absolutely no idea. And usually he'd be going to one of his other ranches. And then you'd get a radio call back and saying, yeah, why don't you bring all those newspaper people up to the Shornhorse place? That was 30 miles away, another ranch. And you'd get up there and his chopper would be sitting there on the ground. Well, that was, he wanted to be he was kicking the bounds of office is what he was doing.
He really was proud of owning those things too, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I remember one time, I might have told you the story, I was quite impressed with all this land that he owned, all over the place. And I said to him, Mr. President, I said, how many acres? No, I asked him, because every place we go there'd be cattle. I'd say, how many head of cattle do you have here? And he gave me some figure, and he said, now I've told you that. He said, but now, he said, I also am going to tell you something else. He said, I answered your question because I figured you didn't know any better. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he says, down here in Texas, he said, a man is measured by how many head of cattle he's got. He said, now back east, he said, you'd never think of walking up to a man and asking him how much money he's got in the bank, would you? I said, well, of course not. He said, well, he says, it's the same thing. He said, you don't ask a man how many head of cattle he's got. He said, because then he's telling you how much money he's got. He says, that's none of your business.
How many did he have?
I don't remember. I really don't. I really don't remember what the answer was, because he gave me that rather stern lecture after that, and I never asked him much beyond that.
All right, now let's get back to when you were getting ready to leave there. Or do you have something else?
No, that's all right.
You had talked a little bit about how you were burned out and how you just stayed about as long as anybody could stay in the job anyway.
Yeah, right. Well,
What'd you do when you first quit? Well, who'd you tell when you quit?
Well, I'd given them about a month's notice.
Uh-huh.
So, I told George Reedy and I told the president that I was leaving, that I'd had an offer to go into a public relations company in Washington, and that which I would become a partner. And it was the firm of Horton and Kilduff, the other partner being a man by the name of John Horton, who was the son-in-law of the former Secretary of the Treasury, John W. Snyder, under Truman. And I'd known John for a number of years, and he had accounts with Universal Studios, and I was bringing in an account from Ireland that I had picked up, and we were going to do what I thought would be public relations. Well, it turned out that public relations in Washington, even today, is not really public relations at all. It's influence peddling. It's who you know, how well you know them, and how much you can get out of them.
And they wanted you because you've been in the
client.
White House? Is that what
In the White House and in the government, and I knew the government. Well, there was no urgency in the job. If things got done, they got done. If they didn't get done, they didn't get done. It didn't make...
the opposite of what...
It was precisely the opposite of what I had been doing.
You know, I don't believe that you'd ever told me on these tapes anywhere about the fact that you'd been to Ireland with Kennedy. You had,
oh,
hadn't
yeah.
you?
Oh, sure.
And that was related to this job, wasn't it?
That was in June of '63.
Wasn't that related to this job?
No, only vaguely. Very vaguely. A man over there by the name of Timothy Murphy, who's dead now, had a tile company, and I'd met him at some reception over there, but he had not discussed it with me at that time. He came to the United States for Kennedy's funeral, along with a bunch of other Irishmen. I met him at that time, and then he kept in contact with me, and had this new tile patent that he'd gotten that he wanted to merchandise and promote in the United States. And I don't know why it never really went. It never really went because I guess we didn't promote it properly, and I didn't know that much about commercial promotion, frankly. And that's, as I say, I had met him and when I was in Ireland, but it was just like I'd met 150 other people. He didn't make any great impression on me at that time.
So how about your job then with...
Well, my job was not a job. It was my own, half my own company.
Yeah.
And I had retainers from Ryan Aeronautical Corporation, which is now part of Teledyne in San Diego, Continental Motors in Detroit, which was a subsidiary of Ryan. And there it was, quote, it was not public relations, it was government relations. It was using what juice you had with people, say, in the Defense Department for tank engines, which were manufactured by Continental Motors in Detroit. It was for Universal Studios. It was making sure you've seen on television, these films that are produced with the cooperation of the government.
So you could use Camp Lejeune to make a movie or something
right,
like that.
Exactly. And, it would be taking a script over. You were a high-paid messenger boy on retainer from Universal. You were there.
How long did you stay with that?
Stayed with that for about 2 years.
Did you make money at that?
I made a little money, more than I was making in the White House, but I was also spending more money. Had a lot of time on my hands that I didn't know what to do with, and I didn't utilize it too well. I spent an awful lot of it in bars. And then got out of that and went into another public relations operation for a while, which again didn't turn out too well.
Where was that?
With a man by the name of Grover in Washington.
In Washington.
Yeah, but that was just a period there that I didn't, a 2-year period that I didn't like too much.
You think you should have stayed in the government?
I think I should have stayed in government. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, how many years had you been in government?
Almost 20.
You should have stayed in government.
Yeah, sure, I should have stayed.
For retirement purposes.
Yeah, for retirement purposes. Yeah, but I'm still eligible to retire. That's the funny part about it.
Are you? How does that work?
Because I never pulled my money out of the retirement fund.
Well, you have to work some more in the government?
No, I've got my required number of years in it. I don't have the age though.
How old do you have to be?
Well, you can draw. I think you can draw retirement when you're 55, and I'm 50. It's a limited retirement, or if you wanted to wait another 5 years and gamble that you're not going to drop dead in the meantime,
you can get more. Yeah. Well, I didn't know that.
So yeah. So I still have my money in retirement.
You're lucky that you couldn't get your hands on it.
Oh, you can, and I still could. I could still. No, I can't now. It's too late now. I could have pulled it out.
I'm surprised you didn't.
Yeah, I'm surprised I didn't too.
Yeah. But, you didn't think about it.
Yeah, I thought about it. Yeah, I thought about it a couple of times.
So what did you do after when you left this public relations thing then?
Well, then I didn't do an awful lot. I then went to I then went to work for the Veterans Administration in their congressional liaison office, and worked at that until 1968, when Humphrey ran.
Mm-hmm. Did you like that any better?
Yeah, it was more interesting. It was. I had worked at one time way back in 1944 for a summer at the Veterans Administration, and we did some rather peculiar work in the VA, where the opposition to the war in Vietnam was building up, and this little liaison group I was working with in the Veterans Administration was working directly with the White House in building records against the anti-war groups.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were cruddy. Some of them were perfectly valid, as we have since come to learn. But of course, Johnson was so hyper on the subject of anti-war demonstrators that he had this little unit hidden away. I don't know if this has ever been revealed, and I doubt that it has.
Must be a good time.
And no, it wouldn't accomplish anything. And he had this, this little group operated, and we saw the FBI files and everything else. And of course, it was across the street from the White House, across Lafayette Park from the White House, and we had easy access and dealing with.
How many of you were involved in this?
About 8. One of the funny part about it was the guy who had the job just immediately before me was John Connolly's former press secretary, who had announced the condition of Connolly at Parkland Hospital when I announced Kennedy's death.
Oh, that guy you were with down there.
Yeah, right, the guy who turned it over. I turned it over too, Bill Stinson. So he left a job with the VA to go into private industry, and I took that job over. And I stayed there until Humphrey's campaign of 1968.
Were you in Chicago?
No, I did not go to Chicago. After the convention, Bob Short, who owned the old Washington baseball team, Senators. Right. Bob Short asked me if I'd be interested. There would be a group formed outside the Democratic National Committee called the Citizens for Humphrey. This is the organization that appears every 4 years, where you're able to operate various committees outside the Democratic National Committee for support, such as there'd be a small committee of doctors for Humphrey, pharmacists for Humphrey, farmers for Humphrey, etc. Goes on ad nauseum in every profession, trade, and everything else. Actually, it's a way to funnel more money into the campaign, is really what it is. You can't do it anymore under the new campaign laws, but it had been done for years that way. And so I went as Director of Information for Humphrey's campaign. And of course, he was defeated in 1968. But as a spin-off from that, I had become...
Well, tell me about what you do during the campaign.
Just stayed right there in the headquarters.
Never did travel, right?
I traveled once, but not with him. I took a entertainment group up to Pennsylvania one weekend. That was the only travel.
Who was in it?
Oh gosh, Leslie Nielsen, the kid who now plays. Oh, what in the world? David Soul.
Yeah.
Connie Stevens. Inga Stevens, not Connie Stevens.
Yeah,
Inga
the one
Stevens,
that died.
she's dead.
But she was good looking.
Yo, wasn't she though?
Dear man.
And we took a group up and held rallies in
Where?
Humphrey's name up Erie, Pennsylvania, and Buffalo. Coming out of Erie, we lost an engine in the plane, which wasn't very comforting, since the plane only had 2 engines.
So you get for flying Allegheny.
Oh, no, it wasn't. It was a charter owned by the ABC Box Company and Twine manufactured. I don't know who owned the bloody thing. But all I know is only my laundryman can tell you how scared I was when the one engine went out. It went about 500 feet over the ground.
So you really stayed in Washington then?
And I stayed in Washington.
So what did you do?
And then, well, after the campaign was over and Humphrey was defeated, there had been formed by Johnson a commission to study the welfare laws of this country. called the President's Income Maintenance Commission, chaired by Ben Heineman of Northwest Industries, Chicago. Well, they were a man by the name of Alvin Spivak, not Larry Spivak, but Alvin Spivak, had been a UPI reporter in the White House when I was there, was offered the job of Director of Information for that program. And cut that just a second, leave Bill.
Okay.
All right, then
When was that now?
that was between December the 9th, 1968 and the end of December 1969. That was the commission that had been formed, which basically came
Was that the life of the commission?
That was the life of the commission, yeah. And it was a one-year commission to make recommendations on welfare reform. And from that I got...
Did you like that?
Oh yeah, I liked that very much, very much. And then from that, I got myself involved in 1970 in a local political activities in Montgomery County, Maryland. A man who was running for county executive, and who lost. A great string of losers.
Your record's been good.
Yeah, I've got the last winner I had. It was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So I worked for Bill Greenhalgh. It's Greenhalgh. And I worked on his campaign. And then I went to work for that was in 1970. Then in February 1971, I went to work for the Senate, for Vance Harkey, who was chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and I was information director for the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs until December of 71. Any questions you've got on that?
Well, I mean, anytime you'd like to tell me about any of the specific jobs, like I don't know how much time you figure you have today, but like for instance, I wouldn't mind you telling me about that welfare committee if you would want to expound on
on the
you
welfare,
did, what your ideas are about it.
Well, on the President's Income Maintenance Commission, which was a commission formed by Lyndon Johnson to investigate and make recommendations on the welfare reforms, we held hearings throughout the United States. And one of my jobs was to do sort of advance work.
Set them up.
And get the necessary publicity in the communities. And we held, I think we held 16. We were originally scheduled to hold 21. I think we held 16 hearings throughout the United States, in Washington, New York City, Manchester, New Hampshire, Bloomington, Illinois, Blytheville, Arkansas, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Seattle, Los Angeles, Atlanta. I know I'm missing others, but it was very interesting work where we'd hear.
Did you have anything to do with actually going out and dragging people in to testify?
No, we had a team that was up there. We did not have subpoena power, although we would always issue invitations to the local welfare food stamp directors and that sort of thing to come in and testify, and then usually half of it would be receiving a testimony from welfare recipients. Jackson, Kentucky was our first one, as a matter of fact. What am I talking about?
Over here in Breathitt County.
Right here. We stayed at Paul's Motel and held the hearings in the LBJ school in Jackson. That was the first one we held.
This is Turner School.
Right. I know all about that.
Yeah.
Is that Marie?
Yeah. So that really was a interesting period.
It was an actually fabulous.
Do you think you learned a lot?
Yeah, I think I learned a great deal about it.
Did you listen to many of the hearings? Or were you too busy?
I was in all the hearings. I was in all the hearings. But I would go out and leapfrog In other words, they'd hold a hearing one week, skip a week, and hold another hearing.
Yeah.
Well, in the week between, I'd be advancing them.
Yeah.
But we had another team out there of people who were contacting the various welfare directors and getting welfare recipients in. It was a fabulous experience. I stayed on the road the whole time for that whole year. And,
what would you say were the major problems in the welfare programs? As an individual, what did you glean from them?
What I gleaned from the welfare programs is the feeling that such programs as existed when I was a kid, and you were a kid, such as the WPA and the CCC camps, were not as bad as we used to picture them back in the 30s, because it put people to work rather than keeping them on a dole.
I really thought there'd be something like CCC come out.
Yeah, when I say that, I don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say, well, hell, those people ought to work.
I know what you
we've
mean.
heard that. What I'm talking about is the alternative to receiving welfare is allowing an individual to maintain his own dignity by giving him a job. Now, that job may not be the most meaningful in the world. It may be only cleaning up the roads and reconstructing picnic sites along the roads.
But it has social value.
But at least it had the value of the man going to work in the morning and doing some work for which he was paid. Now, granted, the pay was not in proportion to the work that he did. It was in proportion to the needs of his family, therefore it coming under a welfare type concept rather than an earned salary concept. But I don't see anything wrong with that. It's a heck of a lot better than just
mailing out every 2 weeks.
Mailing out a welfare check where he's going to sit there, his kids are going to see him sitting there, everybody in the community knows he's on, quote, welfare, unquote. He loses his pride, and that's about the worst thing you can take away from an individual, I think, is his self-respect.
Of course, you can see that in this work you're doing.
Absolutely.
No.
Oh, totally.
Same
totally.
thing.
Absolutely. And so maybe the old WPA, where they used to have cartoons of a man leaning on two shovels and the other guy saying, look at him, he does the work of two men.
Sure, I remember that.
Remember that?
Yeah.
It was either from out of old Liberty magazine or out of Saturday Evening Post or Collier's or one of those old ones. But at least he had that, they had here in Kentucky, you had your Happy Pappy program.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's the thing that bothered me, because the term was derisive. They.
Of course it was.
Nobody even knows the name of the program.
I don't.
No.
And we held hearings in Jackson, Kentucky, where and in the hearings you'll find references to the Happy Pappy program, and I'll be damned if I can tell you what
and that was making fun of them.
It was a work incentive program, I assume.
Sure was.
Part of your WIN program.
It was.
But so what? I mean, at least that man, you were giving him back something more than $1. You were giving him back his self-respect and his pride.
Sure.
So that's basically what the income.
Plus, they did produce things.
Of course, they produced things. They got work done that nobody else wanted to do.
Yeah. I know the CCC programs where I was from, Pennsylvania, literally stopped the whole weevil infestation in the forest there.
Sure. Well, the CCC program, you take your Allegheny National Park that stretches from Pennsylvania down into Virginia. No, that was practically put together by CCC back in the 30s.
So that would be one of the major things you would have. That's one of your reactions to that year's work, really.
That's right.
How about the? What were the dates again with that program with the veterans with Hartke now?
Well, in the Senate, in the year 1970, of course, I did some political work for this fellow Bill Greenhall, who ran for county executive in Montgomery County, Maryland.
Did you like that?
Well, I was back in the political saddle, and it wasn't awfully exciting, and it was just political activity in one county. Then after that, he lost that election too. Then I went to work for the Senate in February of 1971 and stayed there for almost 9 months.
What are your reactions to those investigations, those hearings?
Well, working for the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee was it was a new committee. It had just been established. The House had had a Veterans Committee for years. The the problems of veterans had been handled by the Senate Labor Committee, by a subcommittee of the Senate Labor Committee for years. And this was the first time it came to full flush on its own to work on the problems of veterans, and it is now a full standing committee.
Was that a worthwhile year?
Yeah, it was a worthwhile year. I traveled most of the time with Senator Vance Harkey of Indiana. We were interested in one thing, in the hospitalization programs in VA, and we visited hospitals all over the country.
That famous one in Louisiana, did you get down there?
No, we didn't get down to that one, but we were in California and Washington and Oregon and Minneapolis, places such as that.
Tell me, if you want to, if not, I'll stop this line of questioning. Was your drinking problem becoming acute yet by this time?
Yes. I would say that it was. I was doing a lot of traveling.
Hotel living in the
hotel living, even in the Income Maintenance Commission, for instance. As I look back on it, I realized that is when it was during that Income Maintenance Commission period of time when the drinking became more serious, even than when I was in the public relations work in Washington.
Oh, really?
Because I was on the road. I would travel, for instance, if we were to have hearings starting on a Monday morning. I would always leave and go out on the road, say on a Sunday afternoon.
And arrive there
and oh no, it was even before arriving
in the plane.
It was even before the plane. You don't understand the mind of a good conniving drunk, Bill. I would always leave. In those days, Washington National Airport did not have open bars on Sunday, so I would always make sure that I would leave from the Baltimore airport. Now I always make sure that I got a flight out sometime after 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now that afforded me an opportunity to get to the airports, say around 12, because that's what time the airport bars in Baltimore opened up. And I'd sit there and have a few drinks before the flight left.
Mm-hmm. Did you always like to drink more in a bar than, say, in your room or at home?
Oh yeah, I didn't. I was at that point, I was not much for just sitting around and what we'd call sucking on a bottle.
Uh-huh. You just like being in a bar and talking to people.
Yeah, right, and sit there and have a few pops, but I didn't realize how it was becoming such an integral part of my life.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Although I'd always make
Although
sure
you were even planning airline flights around it.
I would plan airline flights around the drinking hours and make sure that I didn't get into some silly airport when the bar was closed. That would be a total disaster.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I've arrived in Chicago a couple of times at like 6 in the morning and paced around like a butterfly in heat waiting for the bars to open up at 8, which they do at O'Hare Field. That's a terrible feeling.
Yeah.
Unless you're carrying your baggage. Now, there's another trick. You always keep some in your baggage. Now, if you're flying from, say, Fresno, California to Washington and you have to go through Chicago, don't ever check your baggage all the way through, because if you get there at 5 in the morning, you go and you pick up your bag, because in that bag is a bottle, because there's no place else in Chicago at 5 o'clock in the morning you're going to be able to get a drink. So you uncheck your bag and you recheck it on the next flight, but in the meantime you take your bag into the men's room and you have yourself enough to keep going until you get on the plane or until the bar opens at 8. That's how conniving you become.
I do that with cigarettes. Tell me this, what did you do after you left the Senate committee?
Well, it was during the time I was in the Senate committee that one of our trips was to Las Vegas.
I've always wanted to go there.
And I then went to Las Vegas, where I thought this would be, just I was doing some advance work. Senator Harkey was to come in there to give a speech before some meeting group, and I discovered in Las Vegas, here was a town where the bars were open 24 hours a day, and I didn't know that enough not to realize that they weren't being kept open just for me. So I for other personal reasons, which have really no place in this, I stayed in Las Vegas. That was in October of 1971.
That's when you quit government work. You just stayed in Las Vegas.
I just stayed in Las Vegas, and I stayed there for several months until and obtained a divorce from my wife, and stayed there until Humphrey asked me to come back and do some work for him.
When?
That was in '72, in the spring of '72.
So what'd you do when you were in Las Vegas to get money? Did you have a job?
To get no, I didn't have a job there.
You were just in Las Vegas.
I was just staying with friends who had a lot of money, an awful lot of money.
This is like a sabbatical.
This is a total sabbatical. It's an 86 proof sabbatical. Is what it was. And I restricted my but I did.
You sort of dropped out, as they say.
Right, I totally dropped out. You telling me I dropped out. It might be said that, it was an 86 proof sabbatical.
I'm sure it's a horror story, but what were some of the things you did there that were really awful for you?
Almost died. Came down with double bronchial viral pneumonia. And almost died from that. I was drunk in a stupor, and they found me in a motel room. Ended up in Southern Nevada Memorial Hospital. That didn't teach me a damn thing, apparently. And ended up one morning and found out that I'd gotten remarried.
To a beautiful chorus girl?
No, to a woman who was old enough to be my mother, but she looked good under the purple lights of the Purple Horse Saloon.
Yeah.
That marriage lasted 63 days.
You ever hear that song that the girls always get better looking at closing time?
Totally. Well, there was no closing time.
Yeah, but it was the same thing.
We got married at 5 in the morning because at the wee bit of the Heather Wedding Chapel and Supermarket.
Yeah.
And supermarket?
And supermarket. Yeah, it was part of the supermarket. Well,
I imagine that has to be like the low point.
That was totally the low point in my life.
Yeah.
Of course it was.
Yeah. Well, how'd you ever get bailed out of that? How'd you ever get back on the road? Making a living again?
Well, of course, after that, I went to work as a news director from October of '72 to the marriage was after that, but the marriage was I
still
misplaced that. But from October of '72 to October '73, I was news director for ABC in Las Vegas, and I was drinking pretty heavily then too.
Were you doing a good job?
But I did my job well, and until it really got a hold of me.
Yeah.
And I was on the air twice a day. I anchored I produced the shows and anchored them.
Sort of like Ted Knight.
And no, not like Ted Knight. God, I was never that stupid. But no, we did, and I had specials.
Did you have a good program?
That I put on. Yeah, I had a good program, good, solid. I had it tightly timed. There was never any problem. I could always time my programs well, and I was able to function very, very well. And but it finally got the best of me.
And then what'd you do?
And then I wandered back to Washington.
Is that when you went back to work for Humphrey?
Yeah, for a short period of time. No, it was just before that. And I had come out of Las Vegas and then gone back and gone to work for the television station. I'd worked for him in '72, up in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And then I wanted to go on back to Las Vegas. I didn't want to stay on the political road. I just couldn't do it anymore.
So you went back to Las Vegas?
Went back to Las Vegas and stayed there until '73, and then came back to the Washington area in December of 1973.
Well, Mac, when did you decide that you were drunk?
Well, I had done some public relations work in the spring of '74 for a man who had the Virgin Islands Hotel Association account. So I went down and set up a tour of the country of Virgin Island hotel owners. Well, there again, that was the wrong man and the wrong job to set me up with all that rum in the Virgin Islands. But we set up this tourist
expense account.
That's right, a tourist promotional deal in Chicago, San Francisco, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, and Atlanta. So I stayed. His name was David Apter, Apter, and I did that through the summer of 1974, until the summer of 74. And then I went up to Detroit, Michigan to work on the political campaign of Jerome Kavanaugh, the former mayor of Detroit, who was running for governor. So for a few months in the summer of 1974, I worked in Detroit for Jerome Kavanaugh, doing press work for him. But by that time, the booze had totally gotten a hold of me.
Mm-hmm.
And
did you know it?
Yeah, I guess I know it. Yeah.
When did you actually tell yourself you got to do something?
Oh, I'd done that tell myself I'd actually
had to do something.
I had to do something. I don't suppose, Bill, that really came to me until the night of September the 15th, 1974. I was back in Washington by then. He lost the primary. I came back to Washington. I checked into a hotel.
What's the date again in 74?
Well, it was...
December what?
No, it was September the 15th.
Okay, September 15th.
So during the night of that night, I was drinking. And I just looked at myself and I realized exactly what I'd done to myself. Mm-hmm. And I waited until dawn, drank most of the night, and I called Rosemary. And I said, can you help me get into the Veterans Administration Hospital? Now,
then she was tickled to do it, wasn't she?
Oh, she met me she went to the office, she told Senator Hartke, of course.
She knew how bad you were, did she?
Sure. And because she had seen me and I stood her up on dates because I was drunk and everything else. And she said, well, thank God. And she met me she came down to the hotel where I was staying, the Roger Smith Hotel in Washington, and she picked me up in the car. She'll always tell the story. It's a funny story because she said there I was, and all clean shaven and clean and dressed in my best suit.
You didn't look like most of the guys that they dragged in the VA hospital.
Well, the only difference between me and a street bum,
you were shaved,
was the fact that I was shaved and clean and showered, and drunker than a skunk. And she took me up to the VA hospital on that morning, the morning of the 16th of September, 1974. And I went through their program.
How long was that?
Well, I went in there on the 16th of September. They figured that my...
Is that another one of those?
Yeah, sure. And they admitted me, although they claimed they didn't even have an alcoholic program, which was pretty ridiculous because I was being sent there by Senator Hartke, who was chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee. So we knew the program existed. They've always tried to keep that one undercover for some reason. I guess because they don't want too many people flooding in on it. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember too much the first few days. They kept me highly sedated. Because there was...
Do you remember anything about the withdrawal and stuff like that? Do you remember that?
No, because they kept me pretty heavily medicated because I'd naturally be afraid I'd go into DTs and convulsions, which I did not. And then they were worried about that I'd done some irreparable damage to my liver, and they put me into a medical ward for a while.
How was your liver?
Oh, fine. Don't ask me why, but it didn't damage my liver. My liver was swollen, but not irreparably damaged. Of course, you can operate with 10% of your liver anyway. You can have it 90% gone, but I didn't. For some reason, it just never affected it, even though at that point I was probably drinking 2/5 a day. Or maybe 3/5 a day, plus all the beer I could get down, and not eating. I had done that for about a month after I'd returned from Detroit to Washington, and just holed up in this hotel. I just stayed drunk for a month, is all I did. Until I to this day, Bill, I'll never know what made me I just plain got tired of being a drunk.
Or were you feeling sorry for yourself?
No, I was just plain tired of being a drunk. Probably feeling sorry for myself. You got to remember that thought process took place under an 86 proof influence.
Oh, like were you ever seeing your kids when you were in that state?
No.
Think that had any effect on you?
I don't know what had any effect on me. I just knew that I was tired of being a drunk.
How long did you stay in the hospital?
Well, I stayed in the hospital for 3 months. Basically 4 months. But after the first 3 months, after I'd been in there for a couple months, it's a long program, they asked me if I wanted to go to work.
Mm-hmm.
They had a program there where you could work during the day and come back to hospital at night.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this friend of mine owned a chain of drugstores
Uh-huh.
in Washington, similar to your Begley's chain here.
That's the one your son works with.
Well, it did. I just found out last week he's now working for something else. I forgot what it is.
But he works with them.
He's working for the Reconstruction Finance Corporation or something like that. No, the World Bank. He's now working for the World Bank. And so that, as I say, the owners of it were friends of mine with whom I'd grown up. And rather than trying to get back into the public relations hassle of the 3-martini lunch, I decided I'd do something entirely different, completely change the way I'd been living, and see if that would work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with a little bit of luck, it did.
How long did you stay with that?
Until I came here, with the exception of the last few months of it.
So a couple of years.
Oh, yeah. I worked from drug fair. I went to work on the 16th of December, 1974, and
came here in 77.
And came here in 77. In January. So I stayed with that for over 2 years, right up until I did some even part-time work while I took some other employment in August of 76. So I stayed right with it, and was made the night manager. It was an all-night drugstore. After about 3 months, I got my head screwed back on. I stayed at the hospital during the week. Then they let me out for 2 weeks.
Now, during this period, was Rosemary coming to see you in the hospital, or was she
that poor girl came to see me every single night. Of course, the hospital was on North Capitol Street, right up from the U.S. Capitol, halfway between the Capitol and her apartment, where she lived in Silver Spring, Maryland. And she'd stop off every single night.
Was she still working then?
Oh yeah, she worked right until the week we moved here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she worked right up until the very last day. We started down here on a Friday, and she worked on Thursday. So I got into that, and then after I'd been in the hospital for a couple of months, then I went out to see the people that owned the store, and I told them what the problem was. I told them that I didn't feel that I could, and mentally, Bill, I was having trouble with my memory. I was having trouble with, in other words, I'd put down this pair of glasses and walk away and walk out the door and totally forget where I left my glasses. Or left, so it still did an awful lot of damage. Because I've been on a heavy regime of drinking.
For a long time.
And for a long, long while, many years of my life, off and on and up and down. And
let me go back a minute. When did you really start drinking a lot? When you were in the White House?
No, it was
after
I'd
that.
have to say it was before that.
Before that.
I drank pretty heavily after one of my children was killed.
That's right. I remember that. You were still in the State Department.
I was still in the State Department. The White House, I slacked off the drinking because the demands of the job just didn't require it. Although if we were out on a trip, there was always plenty of booze on the plane, on the press plane especially. With no limits, no little 2-drink rule with a cute little stewardess. It was just to take out 2 seats, put in a table, and set up a bar. That's what the airlines did for us. And I drank along with everybody else. I didn't drink any more, or didn't drink any less. But it was pretty heavy drinking. But it wasn't alcoholic type drinking.
Yeah.
And that's
it was still social drinking.
It was still heavy social drinking.
Yeah.
There being a distinct difference between that and the type.
So you say when you started the drink with, in retrospect, what would be alcoholic type drinking, it was after you left the White House and were still in Washington.
Yeah, right. I'd say it was in the late 60s.
Well, Mac, after you got working for the drug company, how long was it before you really, in your own mind, felt you had it whipped? How long did that take?
Well, I would prefer to think, Bill, that I still don't have it whipped.
Well, I know about that, but I mean, but still, there has to be a time when you figure like you're going to be able to function again.
Probably the first 3 or 4 months. After about 3 or 4 months, I went up to New York once. I guess the first time I realized I had it licked. was in the spring
75.
of 75 when Geraldo Rivera, who had the Good Night America program, asked me to come up to New York to do a program with Mark Lane and that whole assassination crowd on Kennedy's assassination. And that was really the first time I'd broken away and then gone off and did my thing. And if I'd wanted to, I could have had a drink. And it was there, and it was offered, and nobody would have known. In other words, I wouldn't have been seen by anybody that knew I had a drinking problem or anything else. In other words, I could have gotten away with it very easily. I had dinner with Jim Bishop that night before I came back, who's a recovered alcoholic himself, by the way. And I suddenly found that, no, I
didn't mean that much.
No, I don't know that it, if that's what it meant. I think that it was a matter of self-respect.
Have you ever had a drink since?
No.
Not one?
No.
You're around people who drink all the time.
I have, you come up the house, there's a case of beer up there, 2 bottles of scotch, 2 bottles of bourbon, and a couple bottles of wine, and some brandy if you like it. Yeah, look.
So really it was by 75 then. And what were you doing then? Just sort of marking time until...
Well, then I was, I was working for the night manager. And then in August of 76, this friend of mine had been a Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Ken Ballou, Undersecretary of the Navy, was Executive Director of the National Petroleum Council, and he asked me to come to work for them, and the pay was about double what I was making at the drugstore. So for the last 4 months I was in Washington, I worked during the week for the National Petroleum Council doing writing and, for their annual reports, and brochures and that sort of thing. And strangely enough, ended up still doing some work for Drug Fair on weekends. Would fill in on weekend work for them, which I didn't mind doing, because that drug company had been awfully good to me. They'd taken a guy
when you needed him.
When they needed me. When I needed them, they were there, and then they came up and they needed somebody. They'd gone through a managerial.
Well, when you and Rosemary decided to get married?
Oh, we had decided to get married. Oh, quite a bit before that, but she wanted to get married here at home.
Yeah.
And she had to go.
It wasn't as sudden as the marriage in Las Vegas.
No. Oh, God, no. And she, of course, had gone through Harkey's last campaign in 76, and she felt that she owed him that after having worked for him for 18 years. And as she went through Harkey's last campaign, I took leave from the Petroleum Council for a month and went out and got in my last political campaign.
If you're your last guy, you lost your last election.
Well, I thought I'd lost my last election, but I got uckered back and went back into politics and took leave from the drugstore and from the
Petroleum Council.
Petroleum Council, and went out for about 6 weeks and worked for Jerry Ford, which...
Oh, that's right. You told me that too.
Yeah, and advanced his the Williamsburg debates, and then went up to Long Island for him, and went out to Portland, Washington. And that was another big test, because there I was back on the political trip.
Sure.
With, the airport layovers and the stewardesses with coffee, tea, me, or booze, and that didn't break.
So what did you do after that was over then?
After the campaign, I went back to the Petroleum Council.
And just stayed that next month and a half?
And stayed the next month and a half until we came here in January.
Was that your first time to come to Beattyville?
No, I had visited in 75 here. I had to come down. I was working for the drugstore. I had come down to visit her one time for a weekend.
Did she always come back here for vacations and stuff?
Because
she strange all those years, isn't it?
Well, she wanted to restore the old house.
Yeah.
And they were working on the house, and so I came down, and the house was in terrible shape. It had been vandalized, broken into,
yeah, you told me that.
Torn apart. And so I'd come down there. We were not yet married, and she stayed with her aunt, and I stayed in the house.
Of course, since you and Rosemary got married, you worked at I don't know how many months you worked in the store down here. How long?
Oh, about 6 months.
Yeah, and then
the Radio Shack.
And then you've been here how many months?
I've been here since January.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I'd established an AA group for Beattyville.
Oh, you have?
Alcoholics Anonymous.
I didn't know that.
Group, yeah. Which didn't take too well.
You did that when you were down the store?
Yeah. I did that on Thursday nights up at St. Thomas's Church, and then I would go down once a week also to the recovery unit in Jackson and talk to the people who were there in the residential situation. And I've done all kinds of things since I've been here. I've joined the Kiwanis Club, and it's kind of nice living in a small community after having lived in a big town all your life, because it affords you an opportunity to participate more in that.
Were you apprehensive at all when you came here?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I wonder what in the name of God are you doing, Kilduff? Are you out of your cotton-picking mind?
Yeah. This is different than Las Vegas.
Well, a little bit different than Las Vegas, a slight bit different than Washington. But the people here are delightful.
Well, that's good. What's your title now in this business?
Alcoholism counselor.
You think you're
I finally found a job where I was able to put 25 years as a drunk to good use.
Yeah. You got a lot of experience.
I've got a hell of a
quarter of a century of experience.
My God Almighty!
Yeah.
Most well qualified counselor they've ever had.
Do you think you're gonna like it?
Yeah, it's frustrating. Because it's frustrating, Bill, because there is no carrot to hold out. You have a situation where
you can't promise anybody immediate success.
That's right, and you can't promise them jobs that don't exist by staying sober. All you can do is try to get them to stay sober for the sake of sobriety, and that's not always the easiest thing in the world to do.
No. What percentage of your people that come in to see you or that you deal with here actually have employment?
About 20% of them
are employed in.
Yeah. I've worked out.
Now those people have a carrot, don't they?
Well, they have more than a carrot. Was assigned by the court.
Mr. Kilduff was called away at this time, and this concluded the interview.